carbon TIG out for you guys. So starting out with TIG in general, actually every weld in general, but TIG specifically loves cleanliness. So make sure you're always grinding off your bevel, clean your bevel up, and always grind an inch on the inside and also an inch back off the bevel on the outside. Remove all that mill scale, rust, pitting, anything that can contaminate the weld. Because like I said, TIG is super sensitive. You want to do it with every weld in general, but like I said, TIG especially the most because it's the most sensitive. Now, setting up my gap and everything, since I've already got everything all prepped up, ready to go, I'm going to be doing an 1/8 inch gap. Now you can use a carbon 1/8 inch TIG rod or anything really to give you that specific spacing you're looking for. It's just, I already happen to have a carbon TIG rod on hand that I trimmed down. Now setting up my gap wise, once I choose my specific spacing that I want, and honestly, it can be a 3/32 gap, it could be an 1/8, it could be 5/32 if you like backfeeding, float wire, or anything like that. But for this setup, I'm going to be doing more of the float, or not float wire, but a lay wire technique. So it works better with 1/8 inch. Now, with my gap, once I kind of set everything together, this is where I want to take my preferred rod that I'm using, which is also an 1/8 inch, and I'm going to be checking to make sure that I got a snug 1/8 inch gap all the way around. And what I mean by that is basically that the wire can't fall through the gap. It's like half the wire goes in and then kind of gets stuck in a way to make my lay wire setup. But also too, with checking my gap, I also want to feel the inside of the pipe. Whether I can get my hand in there, you can use a high-low gauge, anything like that, to make sure that your pipes are not mismatched and everything is nice and even on the inside. Now with tacking up with TIG on this, I'm going to be running, right now I'm on about 85 amps. Usually between, for this technique, 80 to 90 works pretty good. Maybe you have a thicker pipe, bigger schedule, anything like that absorbs more heat. Yeah, you're going to bump it up a little bit. But for this very first tack, I'm going to be doing what we call a freehand tack. Where basically, instead of setting the cup in the bevel and wiggling my way through, which I will do for the actual root itself, but since there's nothing really securing this pipe in place just yet, if I make too much of a jarring move, pipes can shift. So it's why I want to do more freehand, where I'm going to hold the torch with my thumb and pointer, so these fingers are free to be able to brace myself up against my pipe. Now when I go to do my tack, what I'm going to do is lay my wire right in my gap. I'm going to gently kind of do a lift arc setup where I kind of just barely touch the tungsten to the bevel to ignite my arc. I'm going to shoot right up to the top bevel real quick, create a hot spot, and drag it down right over top of my rod. Because bringing that hot spot right to my rod is basically, once I hit the rod with the arc, it's going to melt and lunge upward to that hot puddle. At that point, I'll roll to the bottom bevel, do a brief pause, create another hot spot, and I'll see it kind of lunge back to the bottom. Once it does, I made my full connection, which just means now I'm going to be doing a little kind of up and down zigzag, basically moving the tungsten only as big as my gap, so that way I can focus everything on the push through, instead of walking wide, disperse all the heat in the puddle and the bevels, and then of course at that point my tack lays flat. So make sure my gas is on, and at this moment, because I already intend for my root, I'm running a number 4 size cup, and my gas is only at about 20 CFH at the moment. Because with smaller cups, you always want to run kind of a lower gas pressure, because too much gas pressure coming out of that small outlet, basically it can blow my root right out on me. So we'll do our first little tack real quick. Now we got our fit up looking good. The very first tack, all I'm going to do is make it about 3/8 to 1/2 inch in length. Because if I make that first tack way too big, basically it's going to cause this pipe to really kind of draw up on the other side. And then I'm kind of fighting it to get it back in place. So I make my first tack kind of the smallest, and then the other 3 I'm going to do when I kind of start separating my quarters like a clock. I'll do a 6 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 3 and 9. So now, let me clamp that back up real fast so that it doesn't move on us. I'll pop my rod out, and then of course I got to adjust all my fit up, because sometimes, like I said, when it tacks, it does pull around a little bit. So right there looks pretty good. Got a nice snug, just a hair big right here, but I'm not super concerned at this moment, because when I do my tack back here, in my weld path direction, the pipe is going to turn a little bit, pulling with that weld. So I'm not super concerned that it's just a hair big here just yet. But if it is still a little big after this tack, I can still make fine adjustments. But one thing to remember, especially for new TIG welders, before you go into the next weld with this rod, you always want to make sure this end that turns gray after you get done welding is oxidation. And that is a contamination to a TIG weld, or basically welds in general. So always make sure you flip it to the clean end or take your cutters and cut that in. So since I still got a good end, I'm just going to use this end first, and then after that I'll go in and I'll clip both ends for my other 2 tacks. Now this tack I can beef up a little bit more. Usually my next 3 I'm going to be doing, including this one, I usually kind of make them about 3/4 of an inch in length, just because then at this point I'm kind of really starting to lock things into place. Like I said, now I want to double check which this side, it did pull over a little bit, actually to a pretty good setup. This side's actually pretty good too. So it pulled in the direction exactly where I needed it. Now I'll just kind of clip my ends, so that way I got good clean wire always being reintroduced into the puddle. And 2, with these other tacks after your first one, you could walk them in like normal or continue freehanding. Now I'm just doing freehand because I've already got my tungsten kind of stuck out, which is more for a freehander setup. So I kind of just continue that motion. There we go. Now I don't have to obviously double check this side because now 3 tacks are in. It's kind of going to be locked in for the most part. I'm just putting this 4th tack in, so as I'm doing my welds, make sure nothing really has a chance to shift for me. All right. We'll kick that gas off for a second. We'll get ready to clip that rod so that way it's ready to go for when I actually begin this route. Set that aside for a second. Now my tacks wise, you only want to make your tacks width-wise as big as your gap. So that way, like I said before, you get all that focused push through. And I'm actually going to follow that same routine for the actual route itself. But now before we actually get into the route, we got to do a light little feathering of our tacks to kind of weaken the edges, so that way I can make some good tie-in points. Now with that, my preference is I like to use a 1/16 cutting wheel because it's very fine-tuned to exactly what I want to dress. You can get away with an 1/8 inch also. Just be mindful, bigger wheel, it's going to chew up things a little bit more. Now definitely I would not use a 1/4 inch because at that point it's basically the width of the bevel and it's going to chew some stuff up. So like I said, my preference, I like using cutting wheels for it, but all I'm going to do on the edge of my tacks is I'm just going to kind of lightly boat ramp them, as I like to call it, or proper term of feathering. In the middle, I'm still going to leave nice and meaty. The only thing I'm going to do in the middle though is a little skim grind over top of it just to clean up any oxidation, anything that might have rose on the surface. So once again, I got a good clean metal to tie back into with my fresh weld. Now let's pull this down real quick. So like I said, all I'm doing is just a light little cleanup of the middle, kind of ramping my ends just a little bit, doing a proper feather. So that way when I run off the tack with my new weld and into another tack, I can properly get my new weld and these tacks to bond more efficiently. Now, as I said before, I'm running a number 4 size cup standard. Reason I like the number 4, you can run a 5, a 6, 7. It is a preference at the end of the day. Now me, I choose a cup that can sit inside this bevel and basically get what I call a cradle effect, where basically I let the bevel kind of support me. Like I said, you can run a 5 cup, a 6 cup. It comes down to a preference on it. But now whatever size cup you use, whether it's a small number 4 like this or say a number 7, the only thing that big changes, your tungsten stick out is going to change. So how much the tungsten sticks outside the cup. Now what I mean by that is changing. Smaller the cup, it sits deeper in the bevel, closer to your weld, whereas a bigger cup sits further outside the bevel, meaning your tungsten's further away. So you got to adjust your tungsten stick out to where you're within, I like to be within a 1/16 of an inch of the puddle. Basically I'm hovering dead above it, which means I have full control of the puddle. Because if our tungsten stick out is not correct, basically it can cause one, either me to stick to the puddle if it's too much, or say it's too short for my tungsten, for my cup choice, I can create a long arc effect, which just basically means long arc, I have no control of the puddle. And 2, you'll see kind of a, from the welder standpoint, as you're welding, it looks like a big white flame is growing off the tip of your tungsten. Just means 1, I'm gonna blow a keyhole, blow, I could basically ruin the whole weld. Rod balls up, runs away. Like I said, I have no control of it. Now, along with choosing your cup size to adjust stick out, it's also on your torch angle. Me, I like to stay between almost a 45-degree lean in to about a 30-degree lean back. Now, reason I like to stay in those ranges, because any more than actually going like head-on 45 just about, basically the cup face plants. I can't move it because it's basically slammed up against the pipe. Anything more than a 30-degree lean back, you kind of get on, well, I have to say, the bad belly of the cup, which just means it slides, it gets away from you. So kind of hanging within those angles I said, you kind of get some traction with the cup. So it kind of likes to stay put a little bit better. So I'm just going to double check my stick out, even though I had it out a little far for freehanding, which right there, actually I didn't stick it out too far, even for walking the cup. So actually that works pretty good. Now honestly, running this number 4 cup in there, which is typically like I do like to run on here, but I've noticed my bevels are laid back a little bit more, just the way they were cut. So my 4 cup isn't wanting to sit in there perfectly like I like. So actually I'm going to take a test run with a number 5 cup and kind of give it a feel, which is one of those things we got to do as TIG welders. We got to kind of do a little trial and error on things just to make sure we find that cup choice that actually gives us the least amount of effort we got to put into that weld. So actually putting that number 5 on, I'm getting a little bit easier of a swivel, or what I'm getting at is that number 4 cup set a little too deep in there, so the larger part of the cup was kind of smacking the outer bevel wall, and I could feel it kind of binding just a hair. Could I have gone with it still and made it work? Yes. But once again, like I said, I'm looking for something that's least resistance for me, so less effort I got to put in. Now with your wire, as I said before, this is going to be a lay wire technique where literally I'm just going to lay the wire right in the gap. Just a little bit of pressure on that rod, want to keep it stable, help my puddle sink in. Now rod angle, I'm going to be tipping it up to about a 30-degree angle. So with TIG, we can manipulate the fill rate of the puddle just by rod angle. So what I mean by that is, lower I lay it to the pipe itself, basically the less fill it brings in, where the more I bring it up, it can bring a bigger puddle. So if you're doing a hot pass, fill pass, cap, and you got high, low spots or anything like that, you don't want to have to grind out or add more weld in, you can manipulate that rod angle to change that fill rate for you, which is pretty cool with TIG. But now we're going to get ready to do our roots. So like I said, I'm going to start up in the back tack here, work my way around, and which I can make it halfway with this rod, because once I hit this tack, I'm going to pop the rod out, kind of push the leftover puddle forward, walk backwards to the edge of the tack, and walk forward again, so that way I can kind of break down my tack again to make it accept the new weld I'm bringing into it. At that point, taking the rod out will cause this to oxide, but I'm going to flip it to my clean end to hit my other half right, or quarter I should say right here, which at that point I will have to stop because I'll have 2 dirty ends. So if you guys are ready, let's do it. Throw that hose up over my shoulder so that way it takes up some of the slack. You could also wrap it around your forearm. Just something to take up some slack so it's not flopping in the wind near as much. All right. And just like doing those tacks, I'm only going to be manipulating the tungsten as big as my gap. Now, obviously, my gap and my rod are the exact same size because that's the way I set it up for lay wire where the rod can't fall through. And once the rod's in place, I obviously can't see the gap anymore. But I can see the rod clear as day, so I'm using the rod as the gauge for how much to wiggle that tungsten around to create my puddle size. Like I said before, I want all the push through on the root itself. So the wider you spread that puddle around, manipulating that torch, all you're doing is just spreading all the love up the bevel walls, which then will cause it basically to lay flusher on the root. Because all the bevels are taking all the heat, all the metal you're trying to put into it, which is not always a bad thing. Like if you have a job that requires flush roots, then by all means, that's kind of the little more preferred way. But I like having that little baby bump in there. Kind of shows that inspector there's some reinforcement. Just kind of working my way around, keeping my head in front of that puddle at all times, so that way I see the rod, the tungsten, my path where I'm heading, all in one shot. Because if I fall behind the puddle of my view, the torch will cast a shadow, essentially blocking my view, and I can't see anything. So especially in 2G, always try to keep your head in front of the puddle, or basically torch in line with your shoulder. And that kind of sets you up to have that good view. And so now I'm just working that tack for a second. I'll run my arc down my bevel and snap on out so that way we don't create that fisheye in that ending. Kill my gas for a second. Let you guys kind of take a view with this before I do my other half. So like I said, I'm trying to keep my puddle size about as big as my gap, which you can see is relatively about the exact same size. Now the puddle will grow a hair bigger than the gap, yes, just because of the arc. The heat's kind of spreading it, but as long as I keep my motions just right, all I'm doing is just focusing that view to go right through the gap. In which too, you guys can kind of see in there a little bit, I'm getting that nice little, what we call a wedding band effect in there. Clamp that back up. We'll grab a fresh rod and we shall continue. So the root kind of is like, it feels like not much effort, not a lot's going on. So when we start getting the hot pass, the fills, the bigger motions come out, and what everyone knows with TIG, that nice kind of snake skin effect look. As I said, just take your time, focus on that puddle size. And our motions for our TIG torch isn't like a walk in the cup just yet. I kind of call it like a throttle motion, where I'm just kind of doing like a riding a motorcycle, gas on, gas off, where I'm just rocking into my wrist is all I'm doing. So the easiest way to put it for new TIG welders is just throttle, like you're riding a motorcycle. So then I'll pop that rod out, flip it to a clean end, work the edge of that tack, scoot forward to my other edge, get it nice and warm, insert that rod right up against it, and begin my motion around. Almost to the edge of our tack. I'm just trying to keep my head in front of that puddle best I can, especially up against this edge of this pole here. Work that edge for a second and run down the bevel, snap out so we don't get a fisheye. Well, even if it does get a fisheye running down the bevel now, nice thing is it's on the edge of the bevel, little grinder, little skim, long gone. Biggest thing is I don't want that fisheye or a pinhole on my actual root, because then it's usually a lot of times not just a hole on this side, it goes all the way through. Which then right there, you're gonna fail inspection. You gotta go in for a repair. All right, now that we got our root in, This is where, of course, your last chance, honestly. Assess it, make sure everything is tied in properly. You got the reinforcement you're looking for, whether it's a flush root, if that's what that job requires, maybe a good maximum 1/8 inch push through past flush, which right now we'll take a gander at it, just from the first half, how that went. Yeah, I got a nice solid, good heavy 16th push through, so I'm pretty happy with that. So that means I just met code right in the middle, where we want to be that flush is our lowest limit to 1/8 inch max reinforcement. So like I said, I met code right in the middle. Got all of our tie-in points. And of course too, before we move forward, we always want to either wire wheel, wire brush it, get any crud off the surface that may be on there. Maybe we've got some gas on or something at some point. Got a little crud on it, like I said, because TIG loves to be clean. But the cool thing about TIG is, loving to be clean, it welds clean. So you're not having to deal with all that slag buildup, anything like your stick welding or anything like that. So minimal, if you will, in between pass cleans. Now, before we move on to the hot pass, besides I am gonna bump my amps up. Usually I go about 10 to 15 amps, but also too, besides doing that, go up just a little bit there, about 10 amps. I do need to take this cup for a test drive again. One, to make sure, because I'm still gonna be doing that kind of a throttling motion just like I did the root. It's just gonna be a little bit bigger, where the root I was kind of more of a twitch throttle. Now I'm gonna actually start spreading it out. So I wanna make sure this cup can swing that tungsten, because my biggest movements are gonna be top toe to bottom toe in movements with my tungsten of this root. So I wanna make sure this cup can swing that distance without binding, which honestly, it's binding. So as soon as I hit my bottom toe with that tungsten, I can feel the outer side of the cup, like how it did on that 4-inch, smacking the top of the bevel, and it's making me want to hinge. So essentially that's telling me the size puddle I want to create, this cup is too small for that motion. So I'm going to do a little upgrade real quick. Kind of upgrade from a 5 cup to a 6 cup. And honestly, once again, cups are a preference. I mean, you could hop straight to in my case, from a 5, you could jump to a 7, you could jump to an 8. As long as you feel comfortable and in control of the puddle is the biggest thing. So we'll take it for a little test drive again and adjust our tungsten stick out if need be. Yeah, that 6 is working much better now. But my tungsten stick out's not correct anymore. Since I got a bigger cup, I'm back further out. Now I gotta stick my tungsten out a little bit more. But also at this point too, I'm kind of picky about my tungstens. So what I mean by that is, honestly, I switch them out all the time. Because once that tungsten starts to dull in any way, basically it goes from a nice fine pointed arc to basically a larger, broader arc, which is basically like a long arc effect. So I'll adjust that stick out a little bit. Yeah, that's much better. Like I said, I'm still gonna be doing my nice little motorcycle throttle motion, but bigger motion than what I did on that root. And my rod and torch angle are actually gonna remain the exact same as I did the root, where I'm still gonna fall between that 30 to 45 degree angle with my torch, which on these, now we're kind of got a root in, I tend to lean back a little harder, where roots I tend to be a little bit more leaned in to focus more push. But rod angle, still gonna be the same, about a 30 degree tip up, and I'm gonna be keeping the rod in this position, and if you're doing a 6G also, at the top toe line of the puddle, because we got to battle gravity. Because if I held that rod more hanging bottom, middle to bottom of my root, basically all my fill's gonna drop, essentially. So I wanna make sure all my fill stays up top and I'm just bringing down the leftovers. So we'll go as far as this shorter rod can carry us. We'll stop, take a gander at it, and we'll move forward again. So I'm just gonna arc up, get my little hot spot, which is toe to toe of my root. So that way, as soon as I insert the rod in the puddle, in that little hot spot, it immediately wants to spread. Basically not fight me getting started. So we're just doing toe line to toe line of our root with that tungsten motion. Brief little hesitations top and bottom. You want to pause that top just like literally half a second is kind of what it is. Now, the reason I'm doing that is just stopping on the rod, long enough to build a puddle up that I want to drag down with me, but I'm also kind of hesitating the top to watch that new toe line of my new puddle kind of push into the bevel wall. And then I bring down for the bottom, pause just a hair at that bottom, long enough to see the puddle drop, but also kind of wet that toe line back out. And I don't know how well you guys can see it on the camera for my hand motion on my torch, where I'm kind of, like I said, like I'm riding a motorcycle. Just gas on, gas off, gas on, gas off. And with my amps, roughly, like I said, I was running about 85 for the root, so I'm kind of pushing about 95 right now amperage. Can you run hotter? Yes, you can. But the biggest thing is you got to remain in control of the puddle. Because the hotter it runs, the faster that wrist has got to move. Because if it's too hot and you're moving too slow, yeah, could the puddle outrun you? Yes. But also, too, you could end up heating that root back up, which can cause suck back, because the root's starting to melt again and flex. So always remember, quick across the middle, hold the sides with carbon. Alright, so I kind of ran out of rod there. We'll stop for a new one. We'll take a little look at it again before we continue on. So I got our first hot pass in, or first half. So we got that snake skin everyone knows with TIG is starting to come out now. But you can see from my hot pass to my root right here, the hot pass is just going toe to toe with the root. And that's what's structurally reinforcing that root. Because like I said, if we walk too wide, it generates more heat, and then yes, it can suck that root back. But also too, pausing at the toes of the root, that's what's kind of helping me also structurally make that toe line of the root even stronger. And that's what I want. You walk too wide, you don't structurally reinforce that root, and during a bend test and x-ray, it could show lack of fusion against the toes and possibly break during the bend test. So we'll kind of just clean that end up a little bit right where I stopped. Kind of took the gas away when I ended, removing the oxidation. And we'll continue on again. We'll kind of arc up right at the edge where we left off, do a little preheat run, get that little hot spot, and then roll out with that rod. We'll keep working our way around, taking our time, make sure we're hitting our marks. Move my rod around this pole a little bit, don't get hung up. All right, we're about to make our tie-in. So as soon as I get that new puddle and rod kind of up on the edge of the original starting point, I'll pop the rod out, walk the leftover puddle to smooth, and quick snap. So that way now we got our nice hot pass in. So that way that root's nice and reinforced. So now when I come back with the heat of my fill pass, I know that root's not going to flex anymore or have a chance to flex. Could it? It still can, but its likelihood is a lot less now. So before we move on, we're going to wire brush, wire wheel, make sure everything's good and clean. And then we'll kind of assess, is there any little spots we need to maybe address, a bad tie-in, anything like that. But as of right now, it's looking pretty good. Now coming into your fills, depending on the schedule of the pipe, basically how wide my bevels are, sometimes you can get away with a single bead fill, or you might have to do a 2-bead where you do like a bottom fill stringer, top fill stringer, depending on the size. Now with this schedule of pipe, size-wise, everything, I can kind of go both ways, honestly. I can get away with either one. Now, depending on which way you go, a little bit different technique, different placement of your rods and everything. Where if I went with the big bead, the rod, just like a hot pass, will sit right at the top. So basically, the big spread, bevel to bevel. Now, if it was more a bottom fill, top fill scenario, I would keep my rod actually more in the middle of my hot pass, make that my top stop with tungsten, bottom stop, bottom bevel, and then I would come back in, placing the rod at the top bevel, hitting top bevel to 50% overlap line. Like I said, it can go either way. Now, if this was stainless, I would definitely say 2 bead fill, just because heat. Stainless doesn't care for it as much, or it can't take it, I should say. So, smaller bead profile, I move faster, less heat input. But, like I said, for this scenario, being carbon, and my distances I have, I can kind of get away with either one. Now, one thing I want to check, so even if I went for the big bead, once again, you would have to double check, can this cup carry me that distance? Which honestly, it could. And running the larger bead would kind of start bridging out, walking the cup a little bit more. It'd be more kind of a, I like to call it a hybrid, it's kind of a crawl, because there's still going to be a bit of a bevel left hanging, so not enough to let you go to actually physically full-blown walk as everyone knows it. So it's kind of going to hang me up a little bit and have to make me kind of like do a pivoting crawl action, which I'm going to kind of double check my fill here, or my hot pass, engage with my rod, kind of how much distance is left to fill it out. And that honestly really tells me which way I do want to go. And honestly, I'm probably going to do a 2 bead fill. I'm feeling a little more comfortable with that, filling out quicker. And 2, if I did a single bead fill, I kind of feeling I'm going to have to come back anyways and do a second round of it. Which, in that case, since I'm going to do a 2 bead fill, I know that 6 will work perfectly. Amperage-wise, you can bump it up another 10 or so, stay within that range. But if you feel like that hot pass heat worked pretty good, and 2, your pipe's already hot, you can kind of stay within that range. So like I said, I'm kind of around 95. I'm just going to bump it just a hair, about 5 amps, which I feel like is going to do pretty good for me. But like I said, rod angle, torch angle remain the same. And since I'm going to go a 2 bead fill, I'm going to hold that rod right in the middle of my hot pass. So once again, that will be my upswing stopping point with my tungsten, where I'll meet the rod, and then I'm going to walk it down right to the beveled edge. And kind of get that puddle to stop right at the edge to basically a 16th short. I just don't want the puddle to roll the edge yet, because I'm going to let the cap do that. And if I roll it at this stage, that's basically honestly where I'm going to lose my line of sight for when it's capping time. And tungsten still looks pretty good, so we're going to rock it. And once again, we'll kind of just go as far as we can with this. So I'll get my hot spot, beveled edge to halfway mark, since that's just where my puddle is going to be shifting to. And as I come around the pipe, you'll kind of see in my torch motion, I'm not really swiveling anymore or doing that throttle. I'm actually starting to bridge out the walk. Like I said, it's kind of a hybrid, awkward crawl, because like I said, I'm still got that top bevel kind of hanging on. So that's kind of what not allowing me to fully walk it out just yet. But I'm getting there. The next pass will be a full-blown walkout, for sure. I'm just kind of eyeballing my marks, which is bottom bevel with that bead. And like I said, keeping that rod more in the middle. Use that as my guide for my stopping point on my upstroke. Let's keep making our way around. Biggest thing with TIG, I want to say take your time, but yes, it is slower compared to stick or MIG. But biggest thing is, TIG is just like any other weld, uniformity. So make sure you hit those marks, and that's how you're going to keep that real clean looking walking pattern. Just hitting your marks consistently again and again and again. All right, so I'm about out of rod. Kind of end it right there. Turn this gas off for a second. Kind of let you guys look at this real quick. So basically, like I said, I'm filling half of it up right now is basically what I'm aiming for, where I'm keeping that rod dead in the middle, like I said, using it as my top guideline and stopping that puddle right on that beveled edge. So that way I got a good guideline for later. All right, finish out that last little bit. The fresh new rod, and of course we'll double check tungsten over and make sure it still looks good, still holding its point. Still got a good point on it, but after this pass, I'm definitely going to change it because it's starting to show signs of a little bit of dulling just from heat and everything, but it'll be just enough that I can finish this weld out. Once again, I'll get my little hot spot, juice that rod kind of in the middle run section. Almost to that edge. I can see the starting point of my weld a little bit in my line of sight now. So we know the end is near. Alright, so we'll pop that rod out. Now we're on the edge. Quick snap out. Alright, once again, just like every pass, now's your chance. Assess everything. Make sure you hit all your tie-in marks. There's no oopsies anywhere that need to be addressed, because if there's an oopsie somewhere, whatever it may be, porosity, bad tie-in, cold lap, whatever it may be, it's best to address it now while you're in the moment. Because if you start moving into the next pass and there's an oopsie in that previous one, well, now it's harder to fix, essentially. But as right now, I think everything looks pretty good, so we'll just give it a good wire brushing. We'll clip the end of my wire, so we got good clean end, and like I said, I want to change my tungsten out. And two, now would be your chance if for some reason maybe your amperage didn't feel right and you didn't adjust it during that weld. If you felt too cold and you want more amps, now bump it up for that next one. But if everything feels good, nothing you want to change, cool, ride it out. All right, so we'll clip our ends. Set that there. So then I'm going to change my tungsten real quick, just because like I said, I'm kind of picky. Now one thing will definitely help you guys as you're welding, and you TIG welders out there that have been doing this for a while kind of know what I'm about to say. Try and keep that arm as loose as possible with your TIG hand. So the more you're death gripping, squeezing, all that, the more fatigue you're going to get, or faster you're going to get tired. So you want to kind of keep that whole arm relaxed as possible. Firm grip, but try and keep it relaxed. So longer you can run, actually less shaky you'll be during the weld, because the more you tighten up that arm, the more inward pressure you put, which causes you to kind of have all those shakes. And of course too, besides tiring yourself out, we'll see the shakes in the pattern. All right, so everything looks good there. So next pass, I'm going to be keeping that rod kind of right up, slammed up against that top of the bevel right there, where it's kind of like right up against the bevel. So that'll be once again my top stop, and then 50% overlap line is going to be my bottom stop for that pipe, or that puddle. We'll do it again, and then we'll get ready to get into our cap stage. Double check my hand, make sure everything feels good. So now I'll just kind of warm up tip of the bevel to 50% overlap line, since that's going to be where I'm going to spread that puddle to. So once again, as soon as I add that rod in, it immediately disperses and wants to flow with me. But now, since we are filling out that last little touch of the bevel, I can full-blown walk the cup now. Get into that nice swiveling pattern, kind of the figure 8, as everyone knows, because now there's no bevel holding me back. or giving me any sort of a hiccup hinge feel, if you will. So just like every pass prior, I'm always keeping my head in front of the puddle, torch in line with my shoulder. That way, once again, I'm always ahead of the puddle, get the best views. Ooh, almost running out of rod again. Just fine, because I'm about 3/4 of the way around, it feels like. We'll get ready to stop. We'll finish out with that last bit of rod. There we go. All right, so gas off. Now we're not wasting anything. Take a quick little gander at it. Like I said, then you guys can see now I'm filling it right up to flush, if not right within the 16th. My preference is I like it pretty much dead flush. But you can see like I'm getting that top bead to kind of hit right to the bevel, and just a hair over my 50% line, which isn't horrible, but 50% is kind of that money mark we look for, but looking pretty good right there. I'm just gonna spin it around a little bit. We'll hit that last little touch. We'll get ready for the cap. Brush our ending again. Double check our tungsten, which looks good. All right. Alright, see the end is in near. There we go. So we make our final tie-in, walk out that leftover puddle. Quick snap out. Alright, and once again, now's your chance to assess if anything's high, low, anything like that. Maybe we need to add a little more fill in, grind a little bit because it got a little high. Now is your chance before you get into the cap, which everything looks right now. It's looking pretty good. Other than we'll just give it a good wire brushing, clean up everything. And we'll be ready to start our first cap bead. Like I said, we'll give it a good wire brush action. Now, doing the cap is actually going to be pretty much identical to the way I did this 2B fill, where I'm still going to be keeping that rod kind of roughly right in the center of my fill pass, once again as my top fill, as my top stop point, and then stopping that tungsten right at the bottom bevel. Now when I stop the tungsten at the bottom bevel, I'm not going to bring the tungsten past the bevel. I'm literally going to stop right on it. So that way when the puddle drops, it'll just shift over about a 1/16 all on by itself, roll back up to that rod for more fill again. Now at this point, the way the heat felt and everything, I'm going to leave my amps kind of where they are. Felt pretty reasonable, especially this pipe. Just kind of going pound for pound on it. It's getting pretty hot. So I'm not really going to up my amps unless I really wanted to start speeding things up a little bit in my motions, like moving faster, which you can, but at the same time, sometimes the faster we move, we start running into issues, like basically slipping, stuff like that. So, and since we're into a cap stage, I'm going to flip my tungsten around to a nice clean sharp end. We'll start our first bottom cap bead. And two, you could upgrade your cup. I'm running a 6 still right now. You could upgrade to a 7, an 8, a 10. It's all in preference. But for me, the size puddle I'm running, I'm going to keep it at a 6. It's a little more my preference because the bigger the cup, the bigger the natural swing it likes to do, which means forces you to walk wider, put it that way. Now, since we're kind of getting close on our time limit there, I'm just going to kind of do my kind of like half a pipe for first cap bead, and I'll come back and run the second with you guys. So if anyone has any questions or anything, I can kind of get to you a little bit. Sound good, everybody? All right. So like I said, I'm kind of going to run this half here, so that way I got a little time to answer some questions with anybody. So like I said, rod kind of in the middle, still tipped up to that 30-degree. Tungsten, torch angle, still the same. Now, unless, like I said, you change cups, then tungsten stick out can change. All right, let me just kind of make sure my hand feels good on there. One thing with me, I'm picky, so I kind of like to take little dry runs at things, kind of feel it out, make sure my hand is exactly where I want it. Even with years of experience, I still take dry runs at everything. We'll get our little hot spot, beveled edge to halfway mark. And like I said, now I am full-blown walking that cup. Because I got no bevels holding me back. I'm basically on a flat surface. Keeping that rod about halfway so all my filler kind of stays towards the top. Allows me to keep that kind of a dome roll look instead of rod lower in the puddle, which just means I'm going to get a saggy bottom and kind of a thinner washed out top. Something we don't really want to see. Especially if you get more of that saggier bottom, it can be kind of a lack of fusion spot. So keeping that puddle evenly displaced really gives me that, sigh of relief that I'm making sure everything is fusing in good. This is also that stage, besides the fills, where you're really going to see that kind of snakeskin pattern everyone loves with TIG. And of course, everyone's pattern is different. Some have tighter steps, some have bigger steps. It's all in the way you move the wrist, your cup choice, your tungsten stick out. It's really a fingerprint to the welder. Some have very similar patterns, some have complete opposites. There we go. Shut my gas off real quick so we don't waste gas, because argon's very expensive. All right, so now, like I said, we got our first portion of our cap bead in, which my toe line kind of met right at my beveled edge. Like I said, getting that puddle to shift like a 16th over, keeping that rod kind of halfway up, so that way, basically once the puddle shifts a little high, it does kind of cover about 3/4 of the fill pass up, which is fine. Still leaves me that little ridge for that top side, which is exactly what I want. So now for your top cap bead. So basically what we want to do now, same wrist motion, same torch angle, same rod angle, but now I'm going to be keeping that rod kind of right up against that tip of that bevel's edge. And since I already have my bottom cap bead in and where my fill is kind of recessed back because the cap is rising above flush, it kind of gives me like a little pocket or a ridge that the rod wants to sit in. So it kind of gives me a little stability. Now, all I'm going to be doing once again is rolling right up to my rod. Brief hesitation, just like every other pass prior. Other than the root, that one's just a constant go. I'll kind of hesitate a little bit at the top, split half second, if not less. Just enough to build the puddle up, watch it shift up over that top bevel, swing down for my 50% overlap line. But before we do that, we got to do a little clean again. Because remember, TIG loves clean. Now, one thing you do want to watch out for, even though it's carbon, and carbon promotes oxidation pretty naturally with heat, is all the graying effect in the clean areas that I did have originally. You want to make sure that it's not turning like a real, almost like black. Now that's just heavy oxidation forming on the surface, which at that point you would want to remove it, bring back that shiny metal so that way the puddle would adhere better. But in this case, everything's staying pretty good, so which means my heat input is staying pretty low. So that means good gas coverage, good heat input, travel speed, everything is working out the way I want it. And then final cap bead, because I'm picky, I'm going to switch my tungsten again, which I already used that side, which any of our students here that know me and weld with me know that I'm very picky about my tungsten. Like, I will not even weld with them unless they have a clean strap tungsten ready to rock and roll. Like I said, it's one of the best things you can do with TIG besides giving it a clean environment is always a good, clean, sharp tungsten. Which I'm going to take it for a test ride real quick just because I changed out my tungsten. Make sure I like my stick out. Everything feels good. I like it so far. So time to roll. So take a little test drive with my hand. Make sure everything's right where I like it, which it does feel it. All right, I like it. It's kind of like having doctor's hands. You want to make sure everything feels right in that moment. Like performing a surgery. So get my little hot spot, top bevel, the 50% overlap line once again. Introduce that rod. And I'm just keeping that rod right in place against that top bevel, keeping my line of sight for that stopping point, along with watching my 50% overlap line, but also ensuring that I stop right at the rod with my TIG torch, so that way I can let the puddle rise up instead of making me force it. Because if I walk that rod, or I keep the rod below my tungsten and my upstroke, just means I'm going to get a washy top, which just means the arc is eating base metal instead of feeding on my filler metal. Now granted, we're all human. Yes, we do make little error, little boo-boos, where sometimes you may walk above it in a stroke or two, but you're human. We just got to keep it to a minimum, so that way we stay within code requirements. There we go. So now we got our top cap bead on. I gave it a little wire brushing for everybody, so that way we can see some clean shininess. But also too, when you guys get to caps, when you're welding, new welders, those of you who've been welding for a while kind of know a little bit more with this, where basically, normally when I get to a cap stage, I usually give my arm a few minutes to breathe a little bit. Because yes, if you go root, hot pass, fills, everything back to back to back, you're going to get tired no matter how much you keep that arm loose. So usually, like I said, normally when I'm doing caps, I kind of like to let my arm breathe for a few minutes, run my bottom, clean things up, let my arm rest for a few minutes, and then send it into the last bead, or however many beads it takes. So this is now our 2B cap on a 4-inch carbon TIG out. Like I said, I wanted to leave a little bit of time for you guys, so if anyone had any questions or anything, I'd be happy to answer in our last few minutes of our video here. So has anyone got any questions for me?
What's the difference between carbon and stainless?
What's the difference between carbon and stainless? Well, the big thing is with stainless, grades of stainless do have a carbon content and do a certain percentages, low. Now, the big thing that separates them is the chromium and the nickel, which actually with stainless, that's where you get those, like that color variation, like seeing the blues, the golds, silvers, rose gold. That's the chromium effect. But those two properties are its main corrosion and rust resistance.
How do you practice walking the cup?
Good question. Practice walking the cup. Well, there's obviously learning it physically in the weld. There's a couple other ways. One is you can get a piece of paper, what I tell our students, draw 2 lines about 3/8 apart, which is about a bevel width, if you will, for most pipes or plates. Take the ink cartridge out of a pen, stick it in your torch as your tungsten, and actually walk your pen essentially on your paper, kind of making your wrist do a figure-8 motion. Or you can go to, say, Taco Bell, get a large cup, lean it back, and just basically same thing. Make your wrist do a figure-8 motion, kind of like you're taking a large like barrel or a dresser where you got to lean it back and pivot it.
Tips on shaking.
Oh, when you're shaking when you weld. Now that's kind of one of the things I brought up is about keeping that loose grip. Like for me, I usually just hold on with my thumb and my pointer finger. Like that's how loose of a grip I stay. So these fingers are just like resting. But that's literally just getting you to let go. But I do have a tip for you on that one. It's something an old timer taught me when I was learning how to weld. I don't know if he's even on here watching it, being an old timer, but told me to get a styrofoam cup. Take my TIG torch, hold your pipe kind of horizontally, walk your torch on the styrofoam cup. You want just enough pressure that it etches a pattern in the cup, but doesn't collapse it. And that's how much pressure you need in reality to actually walk the cup. And that's a big thing that got me to loosen my death grip up.
Tips for feeding wire.
So feeding the wire through your fingers. Okay. Now, you gotta have some good snug gloves. Really, you do. Like mine are kind of a little used and abused. They're not good feeding gloves anymore. But me, I like to hold the torch like this, and I kind of do a pinch pull where I'll pull with my pointer and middle finger and kind of slide it through across my thumb. So one of those things you kind of got to just sit at home with a rod, a pen, anything, and just kind of practice that feeding motion. Now another thing you can do, and I did a few times on here, freeze wire, where in this case being 2G where my rod's up top, whenever I did my downstroke, the rod freezes in the puddle up top, which basically it's stuck. And that allows me to kind of let go, slide my hand back, roll back up into it again. So another technique, freeze wire, but like I said, just practice at home, just feeding it right through your fingers with a pen, anything like that.
How do you prevent undercut?
Well, one, with really any welds, one, heat can be an issue. Like if this pipe is just too hot in general to where it really can't take what I'm giving it anymore, can cause undercut. Another thing is, like I said before, with oxidation, where it's kind of getting contaminated out here, or I didn't clean as good initially, left that pitting, mill scale, and the clean puddle's trying to avoid those areas. But also, if you're doing like stick or anything like that, bad rod angle, or in course with TIG, bad rod placement, like where I'm not up in top in this position, I'm hanging down low, can cause undercut.
Why do we do a 2 bead cap?
2 bead versus 1 bead. Now, typically 5Gs, yes, where the pipe is laying horizontally, we weld vertically on it. Typically always 1 bead. There are cases where they're 2 bead if you got a wide bevel, but it all depends too on how wide your bevels are. So 2G, 6G, if we got wide bevels and I'm trying to do those big spreads, it's a lot of excess heat where the puddle can't solidify quick enough to basically stay put, and it starts to sag. Where smaller profile beads like this, I can move quicker, puddle solidifies faster, basically it stays put.
What do you mean when you say hot spot?
Hot spot. Okay, so what I mean by that is when I'm arcing up, I'm not introducing the rod right away, I'm just moving my torch back and forth and getting a wet spot to form. Is basically, I'm kind of remelting the existing weld or a base metal area, so that way it's nice and wet, so as soon as I introduce my rod into it, it immediately wants to disperse.
Do you have tips on a 5G weld?
5G. Single B cap on that one. Keep the rod in the middle of the puddle the whole time, essentially, because you're just spreading side to side. Gravity works better with you in that case. Big thing is, when you're coming from bottom up, I always tell our students here, make sure your elbow follows the same radius of the pipe as you're coming up and around, so that way you keep more proper torch angles. Because a lot of people, when they come from the bottom, they just want to walk out and up and basically not raise the elbow around, and it long arcs the whole side, and top too, potentially.
What's the difference between scratch and lift arc?
Okay, scratch start and lift arc. So now you gotta look at the machine itself too, because not every machine is capable of lift arc. So lift arc is basically where I'll set my cup, or if I'm doing freehand, I'll just kind of touch the tungsten to the metal gently, and that will ignite my arc for me. Whereas scratch start, I'll set my torch up on the pipe, get my basically my torch angle right where I wanted, where the tungsten's almost gonna touch the pipe, I take my rod and I scratch it right across the pipe or material, across the tungsten to ignite the arc, kind of like a matchstick, if you will. But that's all we got for today, everyone. Hope you got some good information, had a little fun, and we'll see you on the next live weld.